Arianna Abdul Nour was the lead youth delegate for the UK to COP28 and also attended COP29. She also works with the Future Leaders Network in the UK. So we asked Arianna if she felt there was a difference between generations as to how they approached the climate crisis.
I've sort of been in the youth climate space pretty much as soon as I graduated. So I have a background in international relations, and then I led the UK youth delegation to COP28 with the Future Leaders Network. And since then, I've been to COP29 and engaged with a lot of other programs and young people. And I really do believe that, for the most part, there is a slightly different approach. And I think one of the clearest examples is the way that youth reframe the narrative. So moving ocean, climate, sustainability issues away from these technical, distant topics to matters of justice, to matters of identity and lived experience. And through my own work, so I work for an organization called Island Innovation, which is how I know Ricardo, who I'll introduce shortly. But we ran the Caribbean Climate Justice Leaders Academy. And through that organization, through that foundation, sorry, I've seen young leaders from small island states challenge extractive tourist models, lead mangrove restoration projects, and push for indigenous ocean stewardship to be included in national climate strategies. So what is powerful is not just their activism, but their ability to build cross-cutting alliances across regions, languages, generations as well. And I think traditional actors and older generations often tend to work in silos. I know that this is an example of that not being the case, but typically you see that as a trend or having to move slowly due to bureaucratic structures. And I think young people, they're not waiting. They're building these decentralized networks using digital tools like Francis referred to earlier, and insisting that climate decisions must include the people most affected, especially those living on frontline coastal communities.
Arianna also spoke about climate anxiety and how young people are concerned about their future.
I think climate anxiety very much, it spans across generations, but I think it's very pervasive among the young people that I've worked with. There is this deep sense of grief that comes with growing up in a world that feels uncertain. And I think that often coexists with rage, but also determination, is what I've seen as a very inspiring thread throughout. And I think what's very powerful is how young people are transforming that anxiety into action, as I said. So whether it's through art, through protesting, through policy advocacy, through education, I think that youth are refusing to sort of be paralyzed by the fear. And actually, climate action works as a coping mechanism. It's for a lot of people, a lot of young people, a way to hold on to hope. And I think that's something that different generations can take inspiration from.
When there is such distrust with politicians as there is in today's world, then we also asked Arianna how that affects young people and if they indeed engage with politicians.
I think there is a relatively apathetic sentiment towards politics sometimes when it comes to, reversing contributions and NDCs to climate. And there's a lot of backtracking with what we agreed as a country supposedly years ago or recently, especially in the Paris agreements. But I do think that our voices are becoming more recognized in this space. There's a lot of initiatives like the Future Leaders Network, like the Climate Youth Negotiators Program, which actually is training young people. And I think that's where the gap is. It's about providing funding, providing spaces, providing opportunities for young people to develop those skills. Because of course, you're not going to be as well versed in how policy decision making happens if you're fresh out of university. No one expects that, but then how do you meaningfully contribute? And it's about providing those opportunities, which is why it's so powerful. As I said, in my organization, part of our role is to train up young people in capacity building. And Ricardo is one of those recipients. And while it's not necessarily always policy based, there's other ways that we try and do it in terms of capacity building that allows people to influence their governments directly. So Ricardo works with land management in Jamaica, and that allows him to have influence over what that landscape looks like.
Although there is a difference between generations and also different communities, Arianna stressed the importance of finding common ground.
So I don't want to sort of make it too split. that it's sort of almost like young people versus the older generation. But I think one thing is that we have the luxury of lack of responsibility. I'm 26, so I don't have kids or a mortgage or other things to think about. So I can kind of be a little bit more reckless with kind of as I'm building my career, what spaces I want to be in and how I want to contribute without having to think about paying the bills in the same way as at the end of the month. And so I think I know a lot of people who have been in the climate space for a while, who are sort of later on in their career, who are doing just as much as young people, but it's just about taking on different responsibilities, I think, and collaborating and making sure that there's that kind of transparency and communication about what the end goal is. Because as long as we're sort of on a mutual ground about what we want to achieve, then we can all play on our strengths. I can play on the strength of having a youth network and of people from different parts of the world, like Ricardo, who are able to bring a different perspective than the community that I'm used to in North London. And that's no sort of one is not better than the other than having someone who's based very much on a local level, who's doing really, really grassroots community level work. So I think that it is just about understanding that common ground and making sure that you're working towards the same goal and taking on filling in the gaps of responsibilities where they can be identified.
Finally, Arianna stressed the importance of climate and that this was something young people were especially concerned about.
Yeah, and justice looks sort of very different across different communities. With the Caribbean Academy that we work with, we obviously work with a lot of overseas territories. So that includes the Cayman Islands, Aruba, Curacao. And people automatically assume if you're part of, a British territory or a Dutch territory or a French territory or a Danish territory, that you have access to that country's pockets of funds. And in theory, you do. But for example, with the Cayman Islands, with our British overseas territories, we take 81% of their biodiversity data to publish in our biodiversity stat. So it makes us look great because, they protect their corals, they're looking after their nature. But when it comes to matters such as Brexit, they don't have a right to vote, even though they have a British passport. So that affects then where they can work, where they can travel, and they're often left out of the climate conversation because they don't have an official seat at the negotiating table at spaces like COP. So that is not a just transition. And this is a common thread across the Caribbean, across the Pacific, across the different communities we work with about having representation at the table. And if you don't, then you can't call it a just transition. If you're not informing the loss and damage funds, if you're not informing the different conversations that are happening at the negotiation rooms. So we're really working to try and actively engage the overseas territories or just any island or any country that doesn't get the same voice and recognition on the global international stage.